Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm deeply concerned that the chaotic and destructive environment being created by President Trump and congressional Republicans is costly for consumers and for businesses, including manufacturers. American manufacturers are working hard to modernize their facilities by adopting AI and other new technologies and training their workforce to meet the demands of advanced manufacturing. And many of them rely on federal financial support, tax incentives, and other federal programs to make this transition possible. But instead of continuing to promote our vital manufacturing sector, President Trump and his billionaire friends are sowing seeds of destruction, illegally halting federal funding across the government, and thrusting our nation into nonsensical trade wars with our allies. So, Dr. Reynolds, I have 3 questions to try to get them in the 4 minutes. How have the programs, investments, and tax credits created by the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law enabled American manufacturers to compete in the global economy, if you will?
Thank you, Congressman. And I agree with you that for all of the great investments and the progress we're making in our advanced manufacturing, we also have experienced in the last few weeks a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty is bad for business, it's bad for planning, it's bad for U.S. manufacturing. But these investments that have come through the different parts of legislation have really sown enormous amounts of investment and opportunity going forward. Particularly the use of tax incentives, I think, has encouraged private sector investment and leverages numbers that we've discussed already that have been very important. Those investments are just getting underway. We have at least a decade ahead of us of watching them come to fruition and bring jobs and investment in communities across the country. And I think it's in industries that not only are important for the country in terms of national security and supply chain resilience, but also in terms of export opportunities, places where the U.S. can lead globally and where we haven't historically. Our companies have been put between a rock and a hard place over time, over decades. On one side, we have actors such as China who are engaged in sort of non-market activities that have made it very hard for our manufacturers to compete. On the other hand, we have investors who are looking for short-term returns from our manufacturers without a long-term view. We now have an opportunity through this legislation in which we have invested in the long-term capabilities of manufacturing in the U.S. And this is an inflection point, a moment for the U.S. in which we can lean in and lead globally in these areas.
Well, I'm going to compress my last 2 questions into one. And you mentioned tariffs, and this is, of course, one of my concerns, that the president and Republicans are raising costs for American families who are already struggling by throwing the United States into trade wars with these tariffs for our closest allies, Canada, Mexico, European Union. So can you discuss the importance of preserving trade relationships with our close allies for access to intermediate goods and external markets for finished products, if you will?
Well, of course, there are appropriate places for tariffs when it comes to national security, when it comes to unfair trade practices. But when it comes to our largest trading partners and allies, it's really not the right place for the use of these tariffs. I think it raises a number of issues. First, of course, it creates this enormous amount of uncertainty. We've seen our manufacturers have to have whiplash over whether they were going to see major tariff impositions on Mexico and Canada, and then to have that paused. It's costly to the economy. It's costly to our manufacturers. Second, as you said, it raises the price of intermediate goods. And it's not just for some industries, it's for all of our manufacturing industries. And so that kind of cost not only makes them less competitive, it also puts at risk our manufacturing jobs. Third, I think it's important for us to recognize that we've had trade agreements that we've all come around with our allies, Mexico and Canada, and that if you break those trade agreements, you're losing the trust and you're losing credibility long term. I think it also makes it harder for us to sell our end products, our finished goods, in those markets. And it's important to understand as well that we have built a manufacturing ecosystem that is not just ends at our borders. It's a North American innovation ecosystem, and it's one that in the auto industry in particular benefits from. Just as a reminder, Mexico supplies about 42% of our intermediate goods in our auto industry, and Canada supplies around 13%. So it's very hard to imagine that you're putting tariffs on some of these partners who actually are part and parcel of our auto industry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate it very much. The gentleman yields back. Now we'll recognize Representative Evans from the great state of Colorado.